To understand the Black Death, you have to understand the Europe it walked into, because Europe in 1346 was already on its knees. For 300 years, from roughly 950 to 1250, Europe had lived through what climatologists call the medieval warm period. Vineyards grew in England, Vikings farmed in Greenland, populations exploded. France alone had roughly 20 million people, a number it would not reach again until the 1700s. Then around 1300, the weather turned. The Little Ice Age began, summers shortened, winters grew brutal, and in 1315 the rain started and did not stop. For 3 years, from 1315 to 1317, harvests failed across the continent. This was the Great Famine. In Flanders, in northern France, in England, people ate dogs, then cats, then, according to chroniclers in Estonia and Poland, each other. An estimated 10 to 25% of the urban population of northern Europe died of starvation before 1320. So when the plague arrived in 1347, it arrived in a Europe that was malnourished, immunocompromised, and packed into filthy, overcrowded cities. Paris had 200,000 people living in conditions that would horrify a modern slum dweller. Sewage ran in the streets. Rats outnumbered humans in many districts by a factor of 5 to 1. And here is what nobody tells you: the plague was not new to humanity. It had already devastated the world once before, in the 6th century under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. That plague killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Europe had forgotten. The bacterium had not. Forward hook, and we will get to where this plague actually came from in just a moment, because the origin story involves a siege, a catapult, and one of the first acts of biological warfare in recorded history. That is where it gets counterintuitive. The Black Death did not start in Europe. It started somewhere in the high steppes of Central Asia, possibly in modern Kyrgyzstan near Lake Issyk-Kul, where archaeologists in 2022 confirmed plague DNA in graves dated to 1338 and 1339. From there, it traveled the Silk Road. Mongol traders carried it. Their horses carried fleas. The fleas carried Yersinia pestis. By 1345, it had reached the Crimean Peninsula, where Italian merchants, Genoese mostly, ran a fortified trading post called Kaffa, modern Feodosia in Ukraine. And here is where history gets dark. In 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde, under a commander named Jani Beg, laid siege to Kaffa. His army was being decimated by plague. According to the chronicler Gabriel de Mussy, a notary from Piacenza who interviewed survivors, Jani Beg ordered the corpses of his plague-dead soldiers to be loaded into catapults and hurled over the walls of Kaffa. If this is landing, save this video. You will want to come back to this one because the details that follow are the kind of history they do not teach in school. The Genoese inside Kaffa watched plague-rotted bodies rain down. They abandoned the city. They boarded their ships, and they sailed for home. 12 galleys, they stopped in Constantinople. They stopped in Messina, Sicily in October 1347. By the time port authorities realized what had come ashore, it was already too late. Within months, the plague was in Marseille. By January 1348, Avignon, the seat of the papacy under Pope Clement VI. By spring, Florence. By June, Paris. By August, it had crossed the Channel into England, landing at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. The speed was unimaginable. The disease moved at the pace of human travel, and human travel in the 14th century was faster than people think. A trade caravan could cover 40 kilometers a day. A ship with a favorable wind, 200. The plague rode every road. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, whose Decameron is set during the plague, wrote that in Florence between March and July of 1348, more than 100,000 people died. Modern historians think the real number was closer to 50,000, but that was still 60% of the city's population, gone in 4 months. Pope Clement VI, watching his court in Avignon collapse, did something extraordinary for a medieval pope. He sat between 2 enormous fires day and night. His physician Guy de Chauliac believed the heat would purify the air. It may have actually worked. The heat killed the fleas. Clement survived. Most of his cardinals did not. But the most haunting account comes from a Welsh poet named Iwan Gethin, who watched his own family die in 1349. He described the symptom that gave the plague its name: black swellings the size of apples in the armpits and groin. They burst. They bled. Death came in 3 to 5 days. In the pneumonic form, which spread through coughing, death came in 24 hours. And here is the question that breaks the section open. If the plague killed everyone it touched, why did anyone survive at all? Because the answer to that question is what redrew the map. By 1351, the plague had burned through Europe. The death toll was almost incomprehensible. Modern estimates put it at 30 to 60% of the population, somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people worldwide. England lost roughly half its population. Florence, Siena, and Hamburg lost 2/3. Some villages, like Higham on the hill in Leicestershire, were simply abandoned. Archaeologists have found over 3,000 of these deserted medieval villages across England alone. And here is the turn nobody expects. The survivors got rich. This was the great accident of the Black Death. Feudalism, the system that had ruled Europe for 500 years, depended on one thing: an oversupply of peasant labor. When you have more peasants than land, lords can pay nothing. They can bind workers to the soil. They can demand rents in the form of labor. But when half the peasants are dead, the math inverts. Suddenly, there are not enough hands to bring in the harvest. Lords competed with each other for laborers. Wages doubled, then tripled. A laborer in England in 1340 earned about 1 penny a day. By 1360, in many regions, that same laborer earned 4 to 6 pennies a day and was offered meat, beer, and shoes on top of it. The English crown panicked. In 1351, King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers, which tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid peasants from leaving their manors. It did not work. The economic pressure was too strong. Peasants ran, they negotiated, they struck. In 1358, the French peasants exploded in a revolt called the Jacquerie, burning castles, killing nobles. It was crushed brutally, but the pressure kept building. In 1381, English peasants under Wat Tyler marched on London, dragged the Archbishop of Canterbury from the Tower, and beheaded him in the streets. The peasants' revolt failed militarily, but the king never dared enforce the wage caps again. Within a single generation, the European peasant was no longer a serf. He was a wage earner. He could move. He could bargain. He could buy land because there was so much vacant land that nobles were selling it cheap just to keep estates running. This is when the medieval map of Europe began to redraw itself. Not with armies, with economics. But the church suffered worst of all. Roughly 40% of European clergy died in the plague. They were on the front lines, giving last rites. The church replaced them in a hurry, often with poorly trained, poorly educated men. The spiritual authority of Rome cracked. People who had watched the Pope's fires while their own families died began to question everything. In 1378, the church split, the Great Western Schism. 2 popes, then 3. The wound never fully healed. By the time Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he was completing a process the plague had started. And then there is the darkest chapter, the chapter that explains why the plague did not just redraw maps, but redrew populations. Looking for someone to blame, medieval Europeans turned on Jewish communities. The accusation that Jews had poisoned the wells. In February 1349, in Strasbourg on Valentine's Day, the city council ordered 2,000 Jews burned alive in a wooden building on the Jewish cemetery. In Mainz, in August 1349, 6,000 Jews were murdered. In Cologne, Worms, Frankfurt, the same pattern. By the end of 1351, more than 200 Jewish communities had been wiped from the map of Central Europe. Survivors fled east into Poland and Lithuania, where King Casimir III offered them protection. This single migration created the demographic foundation of Eastern European Jewry, a population that would remain there until 1939. Drop in the comments, have you ever visited a city where the plague rewrote the streets you walked on? Florence, Avignon, London, Krakow. These are not just old cities. They are cities standing on plague pits. So what did the plague leave behind? It left a Europe with fewer people but more wealth per person. Surviving heirs inherited multiple estates. Surviving merchants inherited entire trading networks. Capital concentrated. And capital, sitting in the hands of a smaller, freer, more literate population, began to do something Europe had not seen in centuries. It began to fund art. The Italian Renaissance does not happen without the Black Death. It is not a coincidence that Petrarch, the father of humanism, wrote his most famous letters after losing his beloved Laura to the plague in Avignon in 1348. It is not a coincidence that the great banking families of Florence, the Medici, rose to dominance in the decades immediately after the plague. They filled a vacuum left by older rival families wiped out in 1348. The technology of the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, exploded across Europe partly because the survivors of the plague had higher literacy rates, more disposable income, and a hunger for the kind of religious self-inquiry the weakened church could no longer suppress. The plague even rewrote medicine. The University of Padua and the University of Montpellier began performing real human dissections for the first time in centuries, because the old Galenic medicine had failed completely against the plague. By 1543, Andreas Vesalius would publish De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the foundation of modern anatomy. That door was opened by the plague, and here is the piece of evidence I promised you at the start. In 2013, archaeologists digging beneath Charterhouse Square in central London, preparing for the Crossrail Tunnel, discovered a mass grave, 25 skeletons, carbon dated to 1348 to 1350. Their teeth still carried fragments of Yersinia pestis DNA. The scientists sequenced the genome. What they found shocked them. The 14th century plague bacterium was almost genetically identical to modern plague, which still kills people today in Madagascar and the American Southwest in Mongolia. The disease that broke medieval Europe never disappeared. It is still circulating. The reason it does not kill millions today is not the bacterium. It is us. Antibiotics, sanitation, rat control, that is the legacy. The Black Death did not leave, it only retreated. And every map of modern Europe, every national border, every language line, every patch of forest where a village used to stand was redrawn by it. CTA 1213 Min. If forgotten history like this matters to you, if you want to understand the hidden forces that shape the world you live in, subscribe and hit the bell icon. New hidden history every single day. But that is only half the story. The next videos in this series go deeper than this one, into the empires that vanished without a single record, the cities that drowned, the civilizations the textbooks pretend never existed. Outro 1315 Min. The strangest lesson of the Black Death is not about death. It is about what death broke. For 500 years, feudal Europe believed in a fixed order. A peasant was a peasant because God made him a peasant. A lord was a lord because God made him a lord. The church was supreme because God made it supreme. And then in 4 years, a bacterium too small to see killed half the continent, and the entire moral architecture collapsed. Survivors did not just inherit money. They inherited doubt. And doubt, applied to authority, becomes the engine of every modern revolution, scientific, religious, political. The Enlightenment, the Reformation, even the eventual rise of constitutional government in England, every one of them traces a thread back to those plague years. Sometimes the worst catastrophe in human history becomes the thing that frees the people who survive it. Sometimes the map only redraws when the old one has been burned. If this story hit, my video on the Justinian plague, the forgotten plague 800 years earlier that nearly destroyed the Byzantine Empire, and is the secret reason Rome never recovered, will make even more sense now. That one is the missing prequel to everything you just heard. In 4 years, between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed up to 200 million people across Europe and the Middle East, more than every 20th century war combined. But the strangest part of this story is what came after. The survivors became the richest, freest, most literate generation Europe had seen in 800 years. This documentary traces the full hidden story of the plague that redrew the map of Europe, from its origins in the Central Asian steppes, through the biological warfare sea at Kaffa in 1346, to the catastrophic collapse of feudalism, the rise of the Renaissance, and the persecution of Jewish communities that reshaped European demographics for centuries. Featuring documented sources from Boccaccio, Gabriel de Mussy, Guy de Chauliac, and modern archaeological evidence from the 2013 Crossrail mass grave excavation in London. Timestamps: 0000, the impossible death toll 00, 45 Europe before the plague 03, 00 the siege at Kaffa 06, 00 how survivors got rich 09, 00 the Renaissance connection 12, 00 what history teaches us. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for new hidden history every day. Black Death, medieval history, history documentary, forgotten history, plague history.